Hello everybody, this is my second recap video for the Southwest class in Fort Worth, Texas. I'm coming off a big win in my first round, and now that I'm in my second round, I have to play against the highest rated player in my section. He is just under 1600 USCF. So with my big win in the first round, I want to continue my momentum, and I have a good feeling if I do well in this round, it should set the pace for the rest of the tournament. So as always, I begin with e4. Oh, sorry about that. I begin with e4. He opts for the Scandinavian defense with d5. E takes d5. And instead of going into the main lines of the Scandinavian after queen takes d5, he opts for the modern variation with knight to f6, planning to recapture the pawn with the knight. Now, it's important here that you don't try to hold on to the pawn with a move like c4. That can run into some trouble and traps. I decided to just play more solidly with d4, allowing him to recapture, but then taking the full center with c4. And in this position, the only move that I've ever seen here is knight to b6. But here my opponent played a tricky move, knight to b4. And now there's some threats on the c2 square. You can imagine the bishop coming to f5 and then him checking me here on c2, and forking and winning my rook. I decide I don't really want to mess with that, so I just go with the immediate a3. Also, he has to drop back to c6, so now his c6 knight is now blocking the other one from coming to c6, and on top of that, he is also blocking the c pawn from coming to c5. Now, in a lot of queen's pawn positions, you can imagine if this was a queen's gambit decline with like e6, you would like to really play c5 in one go without your knight being on c6. So I look at this as already a pretty strong advantage for white. I get the full center, and he has no stake in the center as of yet. So I continue with knight to f3, of course defending my d4 pawn. He plays bishop g4, and right here I play the natural bishop to e2, just unpinning the knight. But here there's actually a better move. The engine is recommending me go immediately for d5 here. And it claims after knight to e5, bishop to e2, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and knight to d7. It is claiming that this position right here is +2 for white. And after a simple move like castle, it just says white is significantly better. I didn't actually know what my advantage was here in this game, and I thought he could just take my bishop. And even though I have like a small space advantage, he's managed to trade off some minor pieces. So I didn't really like this line here with d5. So I just go for the more human response, keeping my center intact with bishop to e2. Now it looks for a second that perhaps he can win a pawn here, but he actually can't. So like say he takes right here, and I take back, and he tries to take the pawn. b7 hangs in the end, and I am winning the rook. So he can't actually win the pawn. So instead, my opponent plays e6. I go knight c3. He plays knight d7, and now the trick no longer works because he has rook to b8 hitting my bishop, and we would then trade the c pawn for the b7 pawn, which is not a good trade for me. So instead, I have to defend my d pawn. So I play bishop to e3. My opponent then plays knight b6, going after my c4 pawn. And I had a long think here about whether or not this c4 pawn could be captured, because if you look at my pieces, I have a full army developed. His knights are very awkward on these squares, and it just looks like in this position taking the c4 pawn looks suicidal. So I decide to castle, Um, the engine line here is actually to just strike immediately with d5, and after bishop takes f3, and not taking back with the bishop because that would drop the c4 pawn, but taking back with the g pawn. And after e takes d5, c takes d5, and knight to e5, simple queen to c2, bishop to d6, f f4 hitting the knight again, knight back to d7, and long castles. And it says right here that white just has a huge advantage. And I I mean I agree. If he short castling here looks suicidal. I have moves like bishop d3, rook g1, and I do see this now that this position does look really good for white. But and black, if he wants to avoid castling short, he has to play a move like queen e7 and then go long. But it's hard to really evaluate something like this in the game where you're capturing with your g pawn when my plan initially was just to castle short. So instead I just stay solid and I castle short here. He does end up taking, and then taking the c4 pawn. And in this position I had calculated that I had this nice move, bishop takes c6, after which he has to take back with the pawn, and then I have this nice queen a4 move, threatening the knight, and also threatening the c6 pawn. And when I had calculated this earlier, I completely missed queen to b6 defending the rook. I thought I was just winning in this line, but in fact it's not actually that simple. After queen takes c6, of course he's going to offer the queen trade and queen to b7. This position is actually surprisingly almost equal for black. Black actually is doing quite well. But in the game, I just thought that this was so much better for white. But it really, now that you look at it, it isn't. Black's gonna get his pieces out. He's gonna castle, and he's gonna play against my isolated queen's pawn. So here he just continued his development with bishop to d6. And then I play d5, the only move to keep some kind of advantage. I'm just trading off my weakness here on d4. And right here, if he takes the pawn, there's some complications, I believe. Like for example, if he takes the pawn here, I don't know, knight takes. There's some risk to taking the pawn. I don't see it immediately. But in the game, my opponent just didn't mess with any of that. He just castled. I then took the pawn. He took back. And then I had a long think. I was calculating knight to b5 here. But I realized it just didn't work after bishop takes h2, king takes h2, queen e5 check, and then king g1, and then he's just winning the piece, and he's just up a clean pawn. So instead I just play the move rook to e1, and he plays the move that I was expecting him to play here, which is queen b3, just starting to put pressure on my b2 pawn. And I saw that I had this rook to e2 move, just defending the pawn. And my plan is really simple. I'm going to move the rook over to e1, and I'm going to bring the queen back to f3, and I'm going to start some kind of kingside attack over here while all of his pieces are distracted on the queen side. So in the game, he attacks my queen. I bring it back to f3, part of the plan. And then he plays knight to c4, attacking my bishop, but also putting pressure on my b2 pawn. So in the game, I play bishop to d4. And he plays the only move to keep equality for black, which is c5. But let's just look at what happens, say, if he tries to take the pawn here on b2. I then have queen g4 threatening mate. He would probably go back to f8, not wanting to weaken the squares with either g6 or f6 around his king. And then I have a simple knight to e4. And as you can see, this position looks very dangerous for black. All my pieces are starting to jump in, and spring to life. Black does not want to go for this, as even if it's okay, it's very difficult to defend this position from a human perspective. So he finds the only move c5, which I just completely missed this move. And now I'm pretty much forced to sacrifice on g7 or just accept a worse position. So I do go for the sacrifice here. King takes g7. And right here I play king g4 or queen g4 check. This was actually a mistake. It's the engine is actually saying if I play a simple queen to f5 or rook a to e1, the position is equal, or white is maybe slightly better. But instead, I play queen to g4 check. He plays king to h8, and obviously now there's the threat of him playing rook to g8, hitting my queen. But I saw this and I played queen to f5, threatening his f7 pawn. And now in this position, black has a very simple way to win. He can just play bishop to f8. And now after rook to a to e1, bishop to g7, white's attack pretty much just eviscerates in this position. I have nothing. I mean, maybe I can win that pawn, but there is no way I'm getting to the king, and I'm just down a piece. But in the game, he actually played queen to b7, just defending the pawn. And in this position, I played queen to f6 check. He played king to g8, and here I just offered my opponent a draw, and he accepts the draw as even though in the game I didn't see the correct continuation here, which is actually a very nice rook to e4, just hitting the knight, and then after the knight moves I win the bishop back, and white is actually winning here. But I was very low on time, and I saw that I had a perpetual check here, so my opponent pretty much could not refuse the draw because of the perpetual check with my queen here. Here, you can see how there's a draw here. Just overlooking this rook to c4 idea. Had I spent more time on this move, I should have been able to find it. But nonetheless, it ended in, I guess, a peaceful draw. He definitely missed this earlier. He missed this idea of going bishop to f8, defending everything. So I think it is pretty fair that we ended this one in a draw. So this pretty much concludes my recap. Thank you for watching.